So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Elise Bremernay at the Department of Transportation to introduce herself and our speaker today. Well, before I do that, James, is there anything else to announce before we turn it over?
I don't think so.
Okay, then Elise, take it away. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Leanne. Good morning, everybody. I'm Elise Bremernay, the Bicycle and Pedestrian Coordinator here at New Jersey DOT. Welcome to the second Bicycle Pedestrian Advisory Council meeting of 2024. Happy spring. It's nice to see so many people here. We have a very special presentation today. To those of you who attend every other month and those of you new, thank you very much for coming. Today's webinar will discuss the U.S. Access Board's recently approved accessibility guidelines for the public right-of-way, or PROWAG. We'll begin with the administrative elements of PROWAG to help attendees understand the next steps of the approval process, followed by a detailed discussion of differences between the draft and the approved guidelines. We'll explain what pedestrian accessibility topics are absent from PROWAG and will require engineering judgment to implement. And then we'll talk about what the adoption of PROWAG means for practitioners advancing the design of street and shared use paths projects. Finally, we'll explain how PROWAG relates to the recently released 11th edition of the MUTCD and the forthcoming release of the AASHTO Bike Guide. Who's going to do all this? Well, we are honored to have Jeremy Chrzan from the Toole Design Group with us. Jeremy is a professional engineer with 25 years of experience in transportation, municipal, and site engineering projects. He leads Toole Design's multimodal design practice, where he works to develop and apply best practices to accommodate the safety and comfort of people walking, biking, accessing transit, and driving. He has led the development of various and numerous local, state, and national design guidance and is an experienced street designer on projects across North America. Over the course of his career, Jeremy has designed or reviewed thousands of pedestrian curb ramps, led numerous pedestrian accessibility trainings, and helped to develop and innovate on new pedestrian accessibility guidance. Jeremy, take it away.
All right, thanks for that, Elise. Can you see my screen now?
Yes.
Great. All right, I'll get started. So thanks for having me. Elise already said what I'm going to talk about, so I'll jump right into it.
Sorry about that.
No, it's fine. So yeah, I'll start with the background, then give you an overview, dig into the details, and then talk about the relationship to the MUTCD. I think we have about a half hour slated for questions, so hopefully that's enough. If not, feel free to follow up with me afterwards. Happy to answer questions. So the background. So PROWAG is a weird acronym. It stands for the Accessibility Guidelines for Pedestrian Facilities in the Public Rights of Way. That's sort of a flipped background, which used to stand for Public Rights of Way Accessibility Guidelines, but that's where that comes from. PROWAG establishes the minimum accessibility guidelines for design, construction, and alterations of permanent and temporary pedestrian facilities that are located in the public rights of way. And some definitions there, pedestrian facilities is going to refer to any structure, route, or space for pedestrian circulation or use. And then public rights of way is going to refer to any street, any highway, or an independent easement, such as where a shared use path would be located. PROWAG does not address existing facilities until they're being altered. And essentially the goal of PROWAG is to ensure that pedestrian facilities in the right-of-way are readily accessible and usable by pedestrians with disabilities. So a little history here. The requirements for accessibility are long-standing. They date all the way back to 1973 with the Rehabilitation Act, which said that activities that received federal funding can't discriminate against a person with a disability. And then in 1990, we saw the adoption of the Americans with Disabilities Act, or ADA, which extended that requirement to all public facilities. And then since 2002, there have been various drafts and versions of PROWAG that have been adapted and modified based on the public commenting process. So in 2013, that was updated to include some guidance on shared use paths, and then it's taken all the way until August of 2023 when the US Access Board finally adopted the final rules for accessibility guidance. It's important for you to understand that this guidance is only going to be enforceable once it's adopted by the US Department of Transportation and the US Department of Justice. What does that mean? It means that the DOT and the DOJ are the agencies that are tasked with enforcing accessible design guidance from the Access Board. And so since those agencies have not yet adopted it, it's not yet enforceable. But in reality, we should all still be using PROWAG for our designs regardless of its enforceability, given that it represents the most current best practice for accessible design. Remember, accessible design is intended to address issues of discrimination against people with disabilities. So following PROWAG will help us to ensure that we're not discriminating as part of our designs. So why does PROWAG matter? Well, it'll become the first national level enforceable design guidance for accessibility and the public rights of way. And to be clear, the ADA already mandated that streets needed to be accessible regardless of the presence of specific design guidance, but the adoption of PROWAG now provides that guidance to address accessibility. And it's important to recognize that accommodating people with disabilities is not about accommodating a small minority of the population. According to the CDC, in 2016, at least 26% of the US population had a long-term disability. And beyond that, most of us will have a temporary disability at some point in our lives, whether it's a broken bone or recovering after surgery. There are a myriad of things that happen in the course of our lives that can give us a disability. So if we're following PROAG, we'll ensure that the public rights of way are going to provide equal access to jobs, education, healthcare, recreation, and all the other opportunities and experiences that we as humans need or desire. But PROAG also benefits people who don't have disabilities. So for example, if we're providing curb ramps, that makes it easier for somebody pushing a stroller or deliveries using a hand truck to navigate between the street and the sidewalk environment. So let's talk about what's actually in PROAG. First, we'll talk about the structure of it. PROAG is set up with the same structure that the previous drafts included. So those of you that had been using those previous drafts should be pretty familiar with it. Chapter 1 identifies the purpose and applicability of PROAG, its effects on existing facilities, and deviations from those guidelines. It also includes a lot of definitions and terms that are used throughout PROAG, and it's worth noting that the Access Board added a lot of new definitions in the approved version. So it is worth reading those so that you understand the terminology that they use throughout the document. Chapter 2 discusses the different scopes of projects, including new and altered facilities. It discusses temporary and permanent facilities. It's also where you learn about anything that's not covered in PROAG, things like structures and other elements that might need to comply with the ADA or the Architectural Barriers Act. Chapter 3 is where we start to see the details for facility design. And then finally, chapter 4 is supplemental details. So that's where you're going to find discussion about things like protruding objects, operable parts like push buttons, clear space requirements, things of that nature. So it's important to understand that the content from each of these chapters works together to ensure that we're addressing the noted guidance and the noted requirements. So what are the topics that are discussed in PROAG? It's a lot, it's numerous, but it includes things like curb ramps, at-grade rail crossings, roundabouts, on-street parking, accessible transit stops, the design of pedestrian signals, where and how we're installing street furniture, and the use of detectable warnings, just to name a few. But it's also important to recognize that PROWAG has been in the making for over 20 years, and there's been a lot of new innovations that are occurring in the public rights of way that are simply not covered in PROWAG. That includes things like the design of separated bike lanes, floating bus stops, shared streets or spaces, electric vehicle charging stations, and other new or less conventional street designs like flush or shared streets. They're not discussed in PROAG. Quick build projects that use flex post curb extensions for pedestrian crossings are also not discussed. And although they do provide guidance on the use of detectable warning surfaces, other tactile walking surfaces that are in use throughout the country are not discussed, things like tactile directional indicators or trapezoidal delineators. Also not discussed are the needs of people with intellectual or developmental disabilities. That's an important consideration that's simply not addressed in PROAG. PROAG mostly focuses on addressing vision and mobility disabilities. Also not discussed is engaging with people with disabilities in the street design or street planning process. This is something that we've worked on a lot at Toole Design. Things like using tactile maps when you're engaging with people with a vision disability so that they can understand what we're talking about and provide meaningful feedback. The importance of leading public meetings and workshops with people with disabilities included and how we address their needs as part of those meetings. These are not things that PROAG discusses. All right, so let's get into the details. I'll focus on the key changes from the previous drafts to what was ultimately approved in the adopted version. I think, yeah, skipped a slide. So let's dive in. In Chapter 2, the Access Board had received a lot of questions and comments about what constitutes a new construction project as compared to an alteration or an added facility. Those were terms that were originally used in the drafts and were adapted based on ADA guidance for accessible buildings. But those aren't terms that are easily applied to the public rights of way. So the approved version of PROAG defines new construction as any work in undeveloped land, things like a greenfield condition. In those cases, the construction must fully comply with the accessibility guidance of PROAG. The only exception to that for greenfield conditions is spaces that are used by service personnel. Things like vaults or tunnels, similar features don't need to comply with PROAG. For an alteration projects, those are projects that are occurring in already developed land. And by developed, they mean containing buildings, pedestrian facilities, roadways, utilities, or other elements. So for example, if we have a road that doesn't currently have sidewalk and we're adding sidewalk and curb ramps as part of our project, then that project would be considered an alteration project. In an alteration project, we're still expected to comply with all of the requirements of PROAG, unless there are existing physical constraints that make that technically infeasible. And the existing physical constraints can include things like underlying terrain, underground structures, adjacent developed facilities, drainage, or significant natural or historic features. It is worth noting, though, that the availability of existing right-of-way was previously listed as a potential physical constraint in the older drafts, but that text was removed. That means that we might need to acquire right-of-way to build something to be fully compliant, and we need to do our due diligence to acquire that right-of-way or an easement to try to design in full compliance. And then if and when we're not fully compliant with PROAG, it's essential that we document why that fully compliant design is technically infeasible, noting all the alternatives that we considered. I know a lot of DOTs have specific forms for documenting technical infeasibility with curb ramps, but really we should be doing that with all of the design elements that are not fully compliant with PROAG. So some other changes, the previous drafts included advisory statements. These were removed or otherwise incorporated as part of the design guidance. The issue with advisories is that although they provided us useful information, they were not enforceable and therefore were ultimately removed from the final version. The previous drafts also simply made reference to the MUTCD, but now content is directly added in PROWAG. So for example, topics like accessible push button requirements at signals or requirements for alternate pedestrian accessible routes are now directly covered in PROWAG rather than simply referencing the MUTCD. The approved PROWAG also clearly specifies that alternative designs, products, or technologies that are substantially equivalent or provide greater accessibility are also allowed as part of PROWAG. And then things that are covered by the ABA would require a waiver from relevant oversight agencies on those specific issues. So when we're designing work zones, pedestrian accommodations still need to be provided that provide the same widths and slope requirements as a permanent facility. So when we're doing a pedestrian detour, we need to be thinking about the widths and slopes of those alternate routes. And although much of the updated content in PROWAG was pulled directly from the MUTCD, there was one significant change, which is the addition of a sign at decision points for pedestrian detours, noting that the sidewalk is closed ahead. The new requirement is that you need to provide a passive detection, so a motion sensing activated sign that provides audible messages or some other non-visual form of communication at that decision point. So while it's always common to put a sidewalk closed ahead, use crosswalk, now we have to have a motion activated sign. The importance of this is because people who can't see can't read the sign, and so they're not provided sufficient information on how to navigate a pedestrian detour. I know that that is probably a new product that many of you are not familiar with. So I've highlighted on the slide here that Minnesota DOT already has 2 approved products for this purpose. One that has a push button and one that is motion activated. I've also heard that there are a few new products that are coming on the market in the next few weeks. So I expect this to sort of ramp up now that PROWAG has been adopted. PROWAG also provides guidance on the design of curb ramps, noting that you need to provide a curb ramp or blended transition for each crosswalk, including unmarked crosswalks, or you can provide a single blended transition that spans over both of those crosswalks on an intersection corner. It clarifies that a landing is only required when a change in direction is occurring. So for example, at the tops of some curb ramps where you're changing direction, you need a level landing. It also clarifies that a 4 foot by 4 foot clear area is needed at the bottom of a curb ramp. And it's important to recognize that those terms are different. A landing is different than a clear area. It's simply a space in the street that makes maneuvers in the street possible. PROWAG also provides options for installing a transitional space at the bottom of a curb ramp or blended transition. And that's specifically if the change in slope exceeds 13.3%, you basically need this 2 foot transition zone so that a person's footrest won't bottom out as they transition from the sidewalk to the street. So like I said, a landing is required where a pedestrian needs to make a change in direction. That's going to facilitate their ability to make a turning maneuver. But there's some guidance in here that I think is a bit misunderstood. So what PROWAG actually says is that the slope in the direction of the curb ramp needs to be 2.1% max. And actually that 2.1% is a change from the previous drafts, which only had originally required a 2% slope. minor, but worth noting. But what it also says is that the slope in the direction perpendicular to the curb ramp simply needs to be less than or equal to the ramp cross slope. So to illustrate that, if you have a situation like this is a curb ramp that is, or a landing that is serving two directions. You can kind of see the detectable warnings tucked behind that utility pole there. What it's saying is that the slopes in this condition should actually match the roadway profile slope or slightly less. And the reason for this is we don't want to introduce warping on a curb ramp. And I've asked the access board that very question to understand, is there an acceptable amount of warping, and are we supposed to be trying to provide 2% landings in all direction? And they said no, that essentially warping should be minimal on a curb ramp. And by minimal, I mean just enough to get the slope less than or equal to the roadway profile slope. And also recognizing that detectable warnings typically come as a rigid panel, so they also can't be warped on a curb ramp. So this is sort of a change in what many standard details show, so important for us to recognize that really the landing should match the roadway slopes, and then any transitional warping should occur as we make the tie-ins to the existing sidewalk. PROWAG also provides guidance on the grade breaks for directional curb ramps, recognizing that they need to be perpendicular to the path of travel for a pedestrian. So to accomplish this, we often need a triangular landing area at the bottom of the curb ramp that again can't exceed 2.1%. We will get into more discussion about detectable warning shortly, but it's worth noting that for directional curb ramps, there's two different configurations. One configuration is if the distance from the curb to your detectable warning is 5 feet or less. In those cases, the detectable warning should be placed at the bottom of the grade break of our directional ramp, like shown on the left. But if that distance would exceed 5 feet, the detectable warnings are supposed to be placed flush against the back of the curb. Now, PROWAG's not clear on where the grade break for this should occur. I know some agencies would put it where the blue line is shown on the image on the right. I actually recommend putting the grade break at the middle red line, and the reason being, trying to put it where the blue line is requires us to cut the detectable warnings, which then gives us a potential failure point for those detectable warnings in the future. PROWAG also provides guidance on the design of blended transitions. It notes that if you have a sidewalk that wraps around your intersection corner, that we need to provide a bypass area that has a slope no greater than that 2.1%. That will allow a pedestrian to navigate around the intersection corner without having to interact with the blended transition. And then finally, PROWAG says that a single diagonal curb ramp is only going to be permitted if two ramps or a blended transition are technically infeasible. Diagonal ramps have this problem that they don't align a pedestrian with their path of travel, and those designs require them to make a turn in the street that's not really desirable. Diagonal ramps also have their own challenges, since if and when you're providing them, the clear space that's provided at the bottom of that ramp must be outside the path of travel of any general purpose lanes or any bicycle lanes. So it's really hard to design them and be fully compliant. So another change from the previous draft is the use of detectable warnings, and specifically at stop-controlled driveways. It notes that if you have a driveway with a stop or a yield sign, it needs to have a traffic control sign. If it has that condition, then we do need to provide detectable warnings across those stop or yield controlled driveways. I'll also note here that there are many stop signs that are installed on low volume driveways that really aren't warranted. So as we're assessing and making revisions as part of an alteration project, I think we should also be assessing whether it's actually a higher volume driveway that warrants the use of a stop sign and therefore is important to provide that detectable warning guidance. The previous drafts also said that detectable warnings needed to cover the full width of a curb ramp when it's provided. However, they slightly modified this guidance to address issues of constructability, noting that we can provide up to a 2-inch concrete band on the edges of our curb ramps to ensure that the panels are appropriately set into the concrete. Previous drafts of PROWAG also required the use of detectable warnings on all curb ramps, including those that access accessible parking or accessible loading spaces. And in the previous drafts, it basically explained that detectable warnings are not a wayfinding tool, and they're simply used to warn a pedestrian that something is changing. However, the finalized version, the approved version of PROWAG, changed this to now say that detectable warnings are not required. Now, it's important to read that explicitly. It says they are not required, but it does not say that they are prohibited either. So as we're thinking about standardizing our designs, we need to ensure that we are applying a consistent approach, that either we are going to include them or we aren't, so that that can be used throughout our jurisdictions. For the guidance associated with accessible parking spaces, they also made some revisions here, noting that the dimensions of an accessible parking space need to be 24 feet long by 13 feet wide. In the previous drafts, it simply said that you needed to provide an 8-foot by 20-foot parking space with a marked accessible aisle. If you read the preamble for the approved version of PROAG, the Access Board explained that this change is to increase the spaces and account for the different uses of an accessible parking space, that essentially some users get out of the driver's side of their vehicle and therefore want to park close to the curb. Others are getting out on the passenger side and will sort of park in line with other cars, and their accessible aisle is between the curb line and the vehicle itself. So by marking it as 24 by 13, it accommodates all the different uses, as opposed to in the past when some drivers actually needed to park in the marked accessible aisle. PROAG also says that you need to provide a 50% clear space along the curb, so that a vehicle that does need to pull up to the curb and deploy a ramp, that there aren't objects like parking meters and things like that that would physically prevent them from deploying the ramp. There are lots of conditions that PROAG didn't envision, things like accessible parking spaces along separated bike lanes, and those are things that need to be closely evaluated. What I had shown here previously, the image in the bottom right, that's what we had in the working draft of the AASHTO bike guide, but really that's going to ultimately get revised to something like this so that it can fully comply with PROAG. I'll also note that they provide guidance on the use of accessible parking spaces and that the widths now need to be 11 feet wide with an accessible aisle that's marked. For passenger loading zones, it's very similar to the parking requirements, except that they are saying to mark it as 8-foot wide with the 5-foot marked accessible aisle. It has the same requirements as that 50% clear area along the sidewalk, again, so that you can deploy a ramp and not have objects that get in the way. For accessible parking and loading, the requirements for this are based on the number of parking spaces on your block perimeter. So this is the table that's included in PROAG, that if you have 1 to 25 parking spaces on your block perimeter, at least one of those spaces needs to be an accessible parking space. Now, again, this is only when we're altering parking spaces. And similarly, if we're only altering a parking space, but not altering the curb and sidewalk environment, we're not required to provide that full 13-foot width. It's only on those larger construction projects where we're actually disturbing both the stuff in the street and the stuff in the sidewalk where meeting this requirement of width is provided. And then with regards to accessible loading zones, it notes that for every loading zone, you need 100, for every 100 feet of loading zone space, you need to provide one accessible loading space. With regards to the design of crosswalks, PROWAG discusses requirements for both grades and cross slopes in the crosswalk, and it's important to keep those terms straight because it can be a little confusing. The grade of a crosswalk is essentially the cross slope of your roadway and vice versa, so keep those terms straight. PROWAG requires that a 5% maximum grade be provided for our crosswalks, and that's consistent with what we saw in the previous drafts. And then with regards to the cross slope of a crosswalk, that design is based on what type of intersection we have. So a 2.1% slope is required at stop or yield controlled intersections, and a 5% maximum slope is required at uncontrolled intersections, as well as intersections that have signals or pedestrian hybrid beacons. And finally, at mid-block crosswalks, it says that we can match the slope of our existing grades. Now, I'll highlight here that these are the same numbers that were in the previous draft, and that's notable because the Access Board received a lot of comments on this 2.1% maximum slope requirement. And again, if we read the preamble, the Access Board explained that that 2.1% will not always be achievable based on the project scope, but that as we're making changes to our street grades, we should strive to comply with these slopes. PROWAG also addresses where crossings are prohibited, noting that you shouldn't provide, well, you can't provide a curb ramp, and you need to provide either a landscaped edge or some sort of vertical detectable edge. And they specify that if you're going to provide a vertical element like that, that the bottom edge of the fence or the vertical element can't be more than 15 inches above the accessible route. This is a topic that I was really eager to see where the Access Board landed on in the approved version. So the previous drafts for multi-lane roundabouts and multi-lane channelized turn lanes said that those locations need to have a traffic control, a signal or a pedestrian hybrid beacon. The approved version, however, acknowledges that the cost of installing signals at roundabouts would outweigh the cost and benefit of installing a roundabout, and therefore notes that one or more of the following treatments need to be provided at a multi-lane crossing. So that's a traffic signal, a pedestrian hybrid beacon, a rectangular rapid flashing beacon, or a raised crosswalk. So the Access Board does not provide guidance on selecting which of these countermeasures is appropriate for your condition. I'll note that although many agencies had adopted the draft versions of PROWAG, this one topic is one that they hadn't really complied with. So both Montana DOT, PennDOT, MassDOT, probably others had developed guidance that looks like this, noting that based on the vehicle volumes and vehicle speeds, under what conditions should you install an RRFB or a signal? So if we modify that, knowing that you need to provide at least one of those 4 countermeasures, this graph might look something like this. That said, if you read what MassDOT had originally written in their guidance, they noted that even in some single lane roundabouts, it may be appropriate to provide countermeasures based on the based on it being a high noise environment or potentially a higher speed or higher volume location. So again, PROWAG does not provide guidance on what treatment is appropriate, nor does the approved MUTCD. So this is one where either we need to get more guidance from the Access Board or Federal Highway, or agencies need to develop their own recommendations again, so that there's consistency in how we're approaching these complex designs. With regards to accessible signals, PROWAG notes that push buttons are required at all traffic signals that have pedestrian signal heads. So that's going to be things like traffic signals or pedestrian hybrid beacons. Previously, the requirements for push buttons were optional, but it's now required anytime there's a pedestrian signal head. With regards to the requirements for these push buttons, they need to include audible and vibrotactile information. They must include a locator tone, and they must include a contrasting tactile arrow that will align with the direction of the crosswalk. Push buttons are still required even if you have passive detection or pre-timed signals. And again, this is to ensure that we're able to communicate both the audible and vibrotactile information that these push buttons provide. Now, again, the requirement for these push buttons is tied directly to the provision of a pedestrian signal head. Now, this doesn't mean don't install the PED signal head so that we don't have to install the buttons. Doing the right thing means installing both the pedestrian signal head and the corresponding push button. The Access Board did not provide any guidance on what actions trigger the installation of an APS push button, noting that that was going to be governed by the same alteration requirements as any other pedestrian facility. And I would expect that either the DOT or DOJ may provide some more guidance on what's going to constitute an alteration that triggers the need for adding the APS push buttons. In general, those past triggers were based on the scope of work of our project. So again, I expect to see some guidance on that in the future. For things like rapid flashing beacons or other types of beacons, PROWAG notes that they do still need to include push buttons or passive detection to activate the flashing lights. However, the messaging, the audible messaging for these types of locations is different, noting simply that flashing lights are on, whereas for a signal or a pedestrian hybrid beacon, it's telling you that the walk sign is on. Another important distinction related to these locations is that they shall not include vibrotactile information. And this is because people who rely on that vibration, that's communicating to them that walk sign is on. And in the case of an RRFB or other type of beacon, there is no walk sign, so we can't provide vibrotactile information. For transit stops, PROWAG requires that if we're altering a transit stop during construction or maintenance, you need to provide an alternate transit stop location. All the other guidance from the previous drafts remains the same. In short, you need to have accessible boarding and alighting areas that connect to an accessible route and to a transit shelter or bench if those things are provided. It's still an important statement, though, that boarding and alighting areas and boarding platforms shall be connected to existing pedestrian circulation paths by a pedestrian accessible route. And if I'm reading that correctly, it means that bus stops can't drop you off on a concrete pad that doesn't connect to a sidewalk environment. So it's important for us to be thinking about this as part of our alteration projects to make sure that our transit stops are truly accessible to people with disabilities. For the design of shared use paths, they did update the definition of a shared use path to clarify that they are for transportation purposes. That differs from other types of trails that might be unpaved and used more for recreation than transportation. So we're tying the definition of shared use paths to this transportation purpose. The approved version notes that if we're designing overpasses and underpasses. They are allowed to exceed the 5% slope requirement for an accessible route, as long as we're providing accessible ramps and landings as part of that transition. Past interpretations of the old drafts were that you actually needed to provide a 5% maximum slope. So this helped to clarify that we are allowed to do ramps and landings. PROWAG also permits the installation of bollards at the base of a bridge to prevent motor vehicle entry, as long as we provide at least a 4-foot clear width. However, I'll note that Toole Design's recommendations and the recommendations in the AASHTO Bike Guide is that the use of bollards should generally be discouraged and reserved really for only those locations where it's absolutely necessary. The reason being that bicyclists have crashed into fixed bollards and been permanently injured or disabled as part of that. So we need to strive to avoid the use of bollards wherever possible. For the design of ramps and stairs, it's important to recognize that ramps are different than curb ramps. They're allowed to have a rise of up to 30 inches, and then you need to have a landing. So essentially that amounts to a 30-foot ramp designed at the full 8.33% before you would need to introduce a level landing. All of this guidance is consistent with the previous draft. And then for the design of stairs located in the public rights of way, this largely remains unchanged, except for that they added a requirement that the leading edge of a stair tread and the top landing need to be marked with a stripe that's at least 1 inch wide, and needs to contrast visually with the material of the step. So either dark on light or light on dark for those markings. So next we'll talk about some of the requirements for pedestrian access routes. So some definitions again. Pedestrian accessible route refers to the accessible, unobstructed path of travel used by pedestrians with disabilities, and that's generally contained within a pedestrian circulation path. The definition of pedestrian circulation path is a prepared exterior or interior surface that is provided for pedestrian use in the public right-of-way. So if we're looking at the image on the right, the access route is the middle of the sidewalk, whereas the furniture zone and frontage zone are not part of the accessible route, but they are part of the pedestrian circulation path because they are intended for pedestrian use. With regards to project scoping, PROWAG talks about that pedestrian facilities must contain or connect to an access route, and then again provides that pedestrian facilities include all of the things shown here on the slide: sidewalks, curb ramps, crosswalks, overpasses, etc. This isn't actually from PROWAG, but I think it's worth noting. The need to build sidewalks is not required in the ADA. It's only required as best practice. Paved shoulders are not a suitable Paved shoulders are not a suitable accessible route in a suburban or urbanized area, but sometimes are considered the pedestrian accessible route in a rural area. I'll also note that the location on the right shows a sidewalk in the distance, and then there's obviously a worn path. So clearly this is a place where people are walking, but those with disabilities are not provided equal access here. So it's important to be closing these sidewalk gaps as part of our projects. With regard to grade, it notes that the running slope in the direction of travel can't exceed 5%. And then outside of the street right-of-way, things like a shared use path, again, we can't exceed the 5% slope requirements. The only exception to this is when the adjacent street grade exceeds that, in which case we're allowed to match the slope or grade of that adjacent street. For cross slopes, I noted before that the maximum cross slope was changed from 2% to 2.1%. And the only exception for this for access routes is that the slope in the street at an accessible parking space doesn't need to meet that requirement. It's going to match the grade and slope of your roadway. With regards to the surface of accessible routes, PROWAG notes that the surface needs to be firm, stable, and slip resistant. And typically that's going to mean installing concrete or asphalt. Yes, you can still use brick or flagstone, things of that nature, but it's going to require proper installation, like installing it on a concrete base so it doesn't have differential settlement. And it's also going to have more maintenance requirements to ensure long-term accessibility. Other surfaces like a beveled or pillowed paver are not going to work because they're going to be too rough or uncomfortable to roll over. And then similarly, we want to avoid designs that have lots of exposed aggregate in our concrete because that can be really rough for somebody using a wheelchair or other wheeled mobility device to navigate over. With regard to grade breaks, PROWAG notes that at the bottoms and tops of curb ramps, those transitions must be flush, so you can't have any kind of lip at the bottom or top of a curb ramp. But on existing sidewalks where we do have some settlement and we're doing sort of a grinding off the edge activity, PROWAG requires that if that lip is between 1/4 and 1/2 inch, you can bevel it. If it's between 1/2 inch and 6 inches, then you're basically designing it as a ramp with 8.3% max. And then if we're exceeding a 6-inch rise, then we have to treat it as basically the same requirements as an accessible route. So it's a maximum slope of 5%. For horizontal openings, things like grates, nothing substantially has changed here. Essentially, it says that you can't have more than a 1/2 inch gap in an accessible grate. And then there was some updated guidance on gaps at railway flanges, noting that the range is from 2.5 inch gap to 3 inch gap based on whether that track is governed by the Federal Railroad Administration or not. And then getting to the end on this topic, PROWAG discusses the design of protruding objects. There's not much that has changed from the draft on this one, except that the board provided a provision to clarify that protruding objects may not reduce the clear width of an accessible route. So essentially, protruding objects should be located in a pedestrian circulation path, but not necessarily within the pedestrian access route. So as part of this, it provides the requirements for the dimensions. Objects that are 27 inches to 80 inches above the ground can't be detectable with a cane. If we're thinking about this design of frontage zones and the buffer between a sidewalk and the roadway, we need to be thinking about the design of these protruding objects. So you can see the image on the top has some planters and signs that somebody would bump into and not detect. Similarly, the way that the water fountain is designed would not be detectable to a person using a long white cane. So there are some changes we could make to the image in the upper right. If we installed another planter box or some sort of curb beneath that planter, as long as that planter then doesn't protrude out more than 4 inches from the edge of that newly constructed planter or curb, that would help to make that more detectable and would comply with the requirements of PROWAG. So then what about the relationship of PROWAG to the MUTCD? For those of you not familiar with the MUTCD, that's the Manual on Uniform Traffic Control Devices. It's a guide released by FHWA or Federal Highway, and it covers the use of signals, signs, and pavement markings, telling us how they look and under what conditions we can and cannot provide them. Previous edition of the MUTCD was last released in 2009, so this has been a revision that's a long time coming. The 11th edition was adopted in December and officially became effective in January. So now the clock is ticking for states that either need to adopt this guide outright or release their own version or supplement that's in general conformance with the federal guidance. But it's important to recognize that the MUTCD was published only 4 months after the release of PROWAG, and so naturally they didn't get everything updated to be in compliance with PROWAG. So there are some discrepancies between the MUTCD and PROWAG, and this is going to create a problem if and when the MUTCD's guidance is less stringent than what's required by PROWAG. So an example of that would be the placement of pedestrian push buttons. This figure shown on the slide here is a modified version of what's in the approved MUTCD. And it identifies that you can locate a push button as far away as 10 feet from a curb ramp. So basically anywhere in zones A, B, or C shown on the slide. By contrast, PROWAG says that the maximum distance is 5 feet from a curb ramp. So if we followed the MUTCD and placed a push button in zone C, that would not be in compliance with the requirements of PROWAG. I'm also highlighting the 4-foot dimension that they're labeling, and you can see that it's labeled perpendicular to the flare of the curb ramp. That guidance is more stringent than what is required by PROWAG. And so sort of taking what I'm seeing in PROWAG and what I'm seeing in the MUTCD, this graphic better illustrates how and where push buttons can be installed to be in compliance with PROWAG. So locating it in zone A or a portion of what the MUTCD referred to as zone B is really where push buttons need to be located. I'm also noting that that 4-foot dimension really only needs to be measured perpendicular to the direction of our crosswalk. Essentially, a person does not need to get in between the push button and the ramp flare as though it was an accessible route, and instead just needs to have that push button within compliant reach as defined by PROWAG. So I can illustrate that concept by looking at the old figures that were in the previous drafts of PROWAG. Unfortunately, PROWAG did not include figures like their previous versions have included. Speaking with people from the Access Board, they did say they are going to add figures to help illustrate some of these concepts. But if we look at these old figures, you can see the push buttons are depicted as being located in the corner, the upper corner of the curb ramp. And you'll note that the landing for that curb ramp, that the push button is within an accessible reach of that landing area. So again, what we're seeing in the MUTCD for the placement of push buttons has some elements that are more stringent and some elements that are less stringent. The MUTCD also provides guidance on the design of push buttons, noting that they should be activated by no more than 5 pounds of force. By comparison, PROWAG considers this 5 pounds to be a requirement that shall be complied with. And while these discrepancies might be minor, I think it's important to get this right and use the same language that these shall be activated by no more than 5 pounds of force. Now, in this particular case, manufacturers know the requirements of PROWAG, and I don't think this is actually an issue, but I think the documents should actually align. Then there's some other discrepancies. So for example, when a traffic signal gets placed in flash mode, which often happens at night, PROWAG notes that the pedestrian push button locator tone shall remain active and that the speech message should communicate that the signal is operating in a flash mode. Because you won't get a walk sign, the vibrotactile function would need to be deactivated. If we look at the MUTCD though, it states that push button locator tones shall be deactivated when located in flashing mode. So there's a discrepancy there between whether the locator tone should be on or off. Now, I'll also note that this discrepancy is particularly problematic because compliance with either of those is technically infeasible in a lot of cases. Essentially, not all push buttons get connected back to a cabinet, and the ability to differentiate whether the signal is operating in flash or not in flash isn't always possible. So this is an area that will need to be coordinated with manufacturers, as well as coordinating the guidance between these two documents. Again, the approved version of PROWAG notes that we need to have one of these countermeasures at a multi-lane roundabout or multi-lane slip lane. By comparison, the MUTCD doesn't provide any of that guidance and shows multi-lane crossings without any of those treatments. So again, something that needs to be updated between those two documents to ensure that they align. And then finally, the MUTCD mentions that pedestrian detours need to be accessible, but notes that you should provide these audible signs at pedestrian detours, as opposed to what PROAG says that you shall provide those treatments. So again, it's just something to be thinking about. And if your state is planning to do an update of or a state supplement or your own version of the MUTCD, these are some of the minor things that could be edited to still be in general conformance with the federal version, while also aligning your guidance with PROAG. And then finally, I'll note that there are some things that the MUTCD did that got out ahead of the guidance in PROAG. So I mentioned that PROAG doesn't mention the design of flex post curb extensions or those types of quick build projects. By comparison, the MUTCD does, and shows that you can either keep your detectable warnings back at the curb lines, and in which case you need to mark your crosswalk through your curb extension, or you can bring your detectable warnings out to the edge of your painted curb extension. And in those cases, you would only mark the crosswalk between those detectable warning panels. I'll further note, though, that Federal Highway has some additional research on these types of installations, and that essentially they're recommending that if you are doing the version in the upper right, that we should be including trapezoidal delineators so that a pedestrian can be guided out to those detectable warnings and ultimately find them. So just a quick wrap up here. As a reminder, PROAG simply provides the minimum standards. We can and should go beyond those minimums. A good example of that would be PROAG allows you to have a 4-foot sidewalk as long as a 5x5 passing area is provided every 200 feet. While that's technically accessible from PROAG's perspective, it's not really. If a person in a wheelchair has to wait for a full minute for another person in a wheelchair to get to them to be able to pass, it's not the same experience that all of us, or those of us who don't have a disability, that we don't have to deal with as part of navigating the public rights of way. Again, PROAG is not comprehensive, so there's lots of these innovative designs that are not covered. And so that's why it's also important to be engaging with people with disabilities, particularly if we're doing innovative designs or things that are not covered in the guidance, so that their needs are being considered as part of the design process. And with that, I think I finished right on time, and we still have 30 minutes for questions. So let me stop sharing my screen.
Thank you so much, Jeremy. I know that was a lot, everyone, and you know, it was wonderfully thorough, because there is a lot in PROAG. There's a lot, and I really appreciate the MUTCD comparisons at the end, since that's also a new guidance document that we're all sort of making our way through. Once again, if you have a question, feel free to put it in the Q&A. Don't feel it has to be a perfect question. If you would rather verbalize it, feel free to raise your hand and we will unmute you so you can ask your question, because we would love to have a discussion next with any sort of questions you may have. Even if you thought it was covered, or you're not sure it was covered, or maybe you missed it, feel free to put it in Q&A. We can cover it again, because it was a lot. So we understood that, you know, maybe something passed you by that was in an earlier slide and you'd like to go back and take a look. So on that note, we do have a few questions already in our Q&A. So let me get started. So it was noted that this was covered, but can you maybe even go back to the slides or explain a little bit about the design guidance for creating pedestrian refuge islands and talk about that a little bit more?
Yeah, so PROWAG requires that if it's going to be considered a pedestrian refuge island, that it needs to be at least 6 feet wide, and that's measured from curb to curb, and that's also tied to the requirement that if we're installing detectable warning panels, that they need to be at least 2 feet apart. So the standard detectable warning surface is 2 feet wide, and then we need to have a 2-foot gap between them. So that's where the 6-foot minimum requirement comes from.
Okay, great. And Paul, if you have any further questions, feel free to put them in Q&A or raise your hand and we'll unmute you if you have anything else you want to add on to that. But we'll go on to the next question, and if Paul, if you want to unmute yourself, just let us know.
Yeah, he did raise his hand. I'll call on him once we finish the other question.
Okay, so we'll go to Linda's question. We'll come back to you, Paul, right after this. So again, so it might have been covered, but the time frame requirements for existing facilities to be updated. I know there's a, we know that the next step is adoption by Department of Justice and US DOT, but I think really in a way, I'm going to elaborate on Linda's question and say, so say we get the DOJ and US DOT adoption this summer, what should we be looking at for some of the infrastructure elements? Will there be, and I don't love this term, but the whole everything's grandfathered in and it doesn't need to be updated until it's touched, or is there other things that can trigger updating to the new minimum standards?
No, that's absolutely right. It's when it's being altered, that's when it needs to be brought into compliance. So we're not forced to rush out the day that the access board says that this is now enforceable and we have to spend all of our agency budget replacing curb ramps or adding the push buttons. However, when we're out there doing a project, that's when we need to ensure that it's in compliance.
Okay, so I think this next question is similar to that. What's kind of a minimum alteration that would trigger the PROWAG compliance?
Yeah, and that's one where the Department of Justice has weighed in on this based on legal cases. So like, it's been clearly established through the legal process that doing mill and overlay is considered an alteration of a crosswalk. And since we're altering a crosswalk, we're therefore altering the accessible route to cross the street. And that's what triggers the need to also upgrade the adjacent curb ramps as part of that process. So it's really tied to the type of work that you're doing. And that's one where, again, I think the access or the Department of Justice and Department of Transportation may provide more guidance on some of these triggers and what constitutes an alteration. I would expect to see that also for the push button one, like what constitutes an alteration of the signal that therefore requires you to install those push buttons. Personally, I think if you're already out there doing a curb ramp upgrade and maybe you weren't doing signal work, the official interpretation may be that you don't need to add the push button because signal work was not part of your project. However, you would be doing the right thing to add the push button when you're already out there disturbing the sidewalk environment rather than only doing half the job now and then having to come and rip it out later when you do signal work to try to install those push buttons. Now, I recognize that doesn't account for the fact that oftentimes projects are funded through different sources. So a resurfacing project may not be doing signal work and you can't pull the money from one pot to make those changes. But I think that's one where aligning agency policy so that when you're doing a project that's disturbing something, maybe we can also find ways to do the other upgrades when we're out there.
Yeah, it would seem there's some efficiencies there if you can do them. But yeah, it does raise the price tag, and where the different budgets come from is definitely a question mark, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay. This one's about driveways. If a driveway does not have a stop or yield, are detectable warnings on the sidewalk required or not required? Should they be on? Should you have sidewalks that have detectable warnings at driveways, even if it's at the same height? Like, can you talk a little bit about that whole, like, the sidewalk height? If it dips down for a driveway, are you adding detectable warning strips? What's the recommendations there?
I might be misspeaking here because I don't have the whole document memorized, but I believe that what it says is detectable warning shall be provided at driveways with stop and yield control. I don't believe that it prohibits the installation at other conditions. However, I would recommend not installing detectable warnings at driveways that don't have stop or yield control, purely from the perspective that those are going to be lower volume driveways, and reinforcing that the pedestrian has the right of way, and that sort of making it clear that to a pedestrian that this is not a location that's high volume that they need to be concerned about. So that's my general guidance on that one.
Okay. That's good. All right, we have a question. Is there any guidance around potential crosswalks where one end is a typical street corner that would accommodate a ramp and detectable warning surfaces, but the other end of the crosswalk would be at a private residence driveway? And we do have, I know this poster's from Jersey City. I know this is all over Jersey City, but this is, we do have this, I've done many a walk audit where this is also the issue. So I know there used to be, you could, if you had the right ramp at the person's private driveway, that could have counted as an ADA accessible ramp. But I don't know if that's still, I don't think that's still the case. I don't know if you have any.
So yeah, I don't, PROAG doesn't discuss the design of a driveway as a curb ramp. That said, I've been thinking about that same thing because here on my street, the city is about to do some curb ramp upgrades. And there's one location that's just like that, where the logical place to put the curb ramp would be basically convert the driveway to a ramp that would serve both users. And I don't think there's anything that prohibits that type of installation in PROAG. Now, I would only ever consider doing that if it was truly a residential driveway or some sort of low volume driveway. We wouldn't want to create a situation where pedestrians will be waiting in the middle of an active driveway if that's a higher volume location. But I don't think there's anything in PROAG that prohibits a driveway also being designed as a curb ramp.
As long as the slopes and all of that are correct.
Yeah, and then the only stipulation there is that we need to ensure that the crosswalk markings fully encompass the curb ramp. So in that case, you're going to have one end of your crossing that's very wide, whereas the receiving side is usually going to be like a standard width curb ramp. And so that might mean either providing one, a much wider marked crosswalk, or two, providing a crosswalk that has variable width to ensure that we're compliant with that requirement.
Never thought of that.
Which
Wow,
it is allowed. There's nothing that in the MUTCD that prohibits a crosswalk from being variable width. So it just requires that the curb ramp be fully encompassed within the crosswalk.
wow.
There's a really good example in Hawaii that I have a photo of that is it must be a curb ramp or a crosswalk that's 100 feet wide on one side and narrows down to about 10 feet wide on the receiving side. And it's just based on the specific conditions of that location and pedestrian desire lines. But yeah, there's nothing that prohibits a design like that.
Okay, that's very interesting. I might want you to share that Hawaii photo if you can pull it from somewhere. That would be really interesting to take a look at. Thank you.
Mhm.
Okay. I actually did say, Paul, you had your hand raised, and I had promised to get back to you, and then I got going with the other questions. Did you want to? Yeah, go ahead, Paul. Do you have to unmute yourself, or do we unmute?
Yep,
Yeah,
no, I got it.
yeah.
Thank you very much. And I see another question by AZ that is sort of related regarding the refuge island. The question I have, are there any guidelines for how far do you have to travel along a roadway to get to a crosswalk? So in the context of what I'm looking at, we have a stretch of Bloomfield Avenue where there is no crosswalk. So what do people do? They cross where there is no crosswalk. It's a big wide stretch. And to the AZ's question, is there a set requirement for how long a crosswalk can be without having a refuge island? And what we have in my context is nothing. You have to travel quite a ways along Bloomfield Avenue to get to a signalized intersection where there is a crosswalk. So people don't do that. And it's right opposite the entrance to a park.
Good
So,
question.
yeah, I think there's a few questions there. So
Yeah, sorry, thank you.
No, it's fine. There's nothing in PROWAG that says if your crosswalk is so long that you have to provide a refuge. So that's not a requirement of either PROWAG or the MUTCD. And then in terms of when there aren't adequate crossing opportunities, sometimes if there's a side street that's uncontrolled, then there is technically an unmarked crosswalk where that side street tees into another street, and that is a legal place to cross.
Thank you.
That said, many drivers are not aware of those requirements, and particularly in locations where we're trying to provide access to a park and children are trying to cross there, I would look at the Federal Highway Steps Guide and identify the countermeasures that will help to encourage motorist yielding. Other design guides provide recommendations to be looking at and assessing pedestrian desire lines, and then providing crossing opportunities where those desire lines exist. But that's more of a design issue that's not covered in PROAG.
Thank you. So just for clarification, as a street enters another at a T, so to speak, there is the implied crosswalk ability to cross at that point, even if there's not a painted crosswalk.
Yeah, and I mean, it varies from state to state, but the laws are fairly consistent that it talks about that where two streets intersect, the promulgation of that sidewalk into the street is a crosswalk, whether it's marked or not. So it is still a legal place to cross. And PROAG would tell you that you do still need to provide curb ramps since that is a legal crosswalk, even though it's unmarked.
Great, thank you.
Great clarification. Thank you.
And actually, I'll elaborate slightly more on
Go
that.
ahead.
It is something that we need to be thinking about, that particularly where we have high volume locations, it will be important for us to communicate to pedestrians that that is not a legal crosswalk, and to provide the landscaped area and not provide the curb ramp if we don't want them to cross there, essentially making it not accessible to cross a location that is not safe to cross. So yeah, this is one where I think it will be important for agencies to have clearly defined policies to address issues like that, given that there is a legal crossing if there is a street with the sidewalk that creates an unmarked crosswalk.
Yeah, I think the challenge becomes if there are few, if legal marked or unmarked crosswalks are few and far between.
Mm-hmm.
That's where it gets extremely difficult. And so then there's no particular distance set about, how far are you requiring somebody with a disability to get to a legal crosswalk? That's up to interpretation.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So here's an interesting question. Do planners need to adhere to both MUTCD and PROAG, or is PROWAG adherence not required?
Well, right now, technically neither. So PROAG is not yet enforceable because it hasn't been adopted by the DOT and DOJ. So, like I said, you should still be using it since it represents best practice, but there's not a legal requirement yet to use PROAG. But similarly, the MUTCD is the federal version, but each state has 2 years to either adopt the federal version or create their own supplement or their own standalone MUTCD. So right now, we also don't need to comply with the federal MUTCD. In each state, you will need to comply with your state's version of that. But yeah, that's an important distinction.
One of our colleagues over at the who teaches our ADA design guidelines over at Rutgers, Kate, said MUTCD is enforceable in New Jersey since we're automatic adopt state via Title 39, which is our motor vehicle code. So that's an interesting thing, Ted. Actually, I wasn't aware of that. So you know, if you have a moment I'd love to unmute you and, you know, if you have anything else to add on that, because I know this is something that, you know, Ted is one of the instructors for our LTAP program. So go ahead, Ted.
Hopefully you can hear me.
Yes, we can.
Okay. Yeah, several years ago now, New Jersey DOT worked with the legislators to make sure that Title 39 included the automatic adoption of any revisions to the MUTCD, because there was a lot of delays in New Jersey DOT as a whole adopting it for the state. So that was included. It was also included in NJAC 16 someplace as well, in the administrative codes as well. So that goes back like over 20 years ago now. And I think everybody that was involved with that New Jersey DOT have since retired.
Well, then it's possible New Jersey is the only state then that the national version of the MUTCD is currently enforceable for that.
Is that enforceable on all roads? So you're talking
New Jersey DOT on their roads have 2 years, but it only applies to their roads, and same with the turnpike.
Okay, so this is really, so the MUTCD, the newest version adoptable, it's already enforceable on county and municipal roads, but the state still has 2 years to adopt for the state roads. Okay.
We're going to have weird things like New York State, where strangely, the way they wrote their legislation, they have to use the new MUTCD until they come up with their new state-specific MUTCD. They didn't write their legislation right.
Okay. Interesting. All right. I guess you know, we had heard that with the new MUTCD that we can, you know, things like the new bicycle clearance sign can go out already on municipal and county roads, but it, you know, was going to take the state adoption of the MUTCD to address that on the state level. So now I get that was part of a Title 39. I didn't realize the connection. Thank you for that, Ted. Probably others knew. I didn't know. Okay, let me go on with some of the more questions in chat or in the Q&A. Do any of the updates to PROWAG provide greater guidance for accessibility in the design of shared streets that have minimal delineation between pedestrian and vehicle travel spaces?
Yeah, that's one of those innovative designs that PROAG does not address. For the design of those types of facilities, you'd want to look at Federal Highways Accessible Shared Streets Guide, which does talk about the use of directional indicators to clearly delineate what the accessible route is and differentiating that from the shared street environment. I don't think it's published yet, but we've been working with Montgomery County, Maryland to develop a accessibility guide for both shared streets and flush streets, and it's important to differentiate between them. A shared street is intended to be crossed by pedestrians anywhere, whereas a flush street would have more clearly defined crossing locations, but would have essentially no curb. We actually do recommend installing a small beveled curb to help differentiate between the pedestrian space and the vehicular space. So there is an important distinction between those two facilities, but I would expect that the county will post that on their website here in the near future.
Do you have a good picture of that beveled curb that you could share with us as well, along with the Hawaii picture? Or maybe we can find it on Google Street View or something. I'm just curious what it'd be nice to have a visual for that personally.
Yeah,
I feel like
the
I've
bevel,
seen it, but I want to see what you, like a good example.
the bevel, that would be a curb that is 6 inches wide with a 2-inch height on the sidewalk side that tapers down to street level. So very similar to the look of a mountable curb. So that 6-inch wide by 2-inch high, that's a curb type that's been used in a lot of places now. But I think the city of Vancouver in Canada, they were the first ones to be using that along their separated bike lanes to help differentiate a intermediate level bike lane from a sidewalk at sidewalk level. And so that's one of those areas where the AASHTO bike guide provides similar guidance that we'd rather you build an intermediate level bike lane versus a sidewalk level bike lane because of this accessibility issue. And yeah, I'll see if I can find the street view
I'm glad you
location.
mentioned Vancouver. I think I might have one, come to think of it. I do have some, I did take a lot of pictures the last time I was in Vancouver of those kind of situations. So, but before we go on to other questions, you've mentioned a couple of times, can you explain the AASHTO bike guide and the current situation briefly?
Yeah, what was supposed to be the 2018 AASHTO bike guide that I've been working on for a long time now. The guide is approved through balloting. So the AASHTO panel has approved what we submitted a few years ago. However, now it's in the publication process and they're trying to make revisions to align it with the MUTCD as well as with PROWAG. So we have already updated the text to align with PROWAG, and we're going through the process of making edits to align with the MUTCD. I was hopeful that it will get published this year, but I've been saying that for years now, so it may not ultimately get published until next year. It's sort of out of our hands and really in the AASHTO publication process's hands. But yes, I would expect that it will come out sometime in the next year. Those of you that have heard me speak before will understand that I've said that many times, but I think we're actually close this time.
And I'm going to put in chat, AASHTO is the American Association of State Highway and Transportation Officials. So I put a little note about what AASHTO is, because I don't know if everybody on the call even has heard of AASHTO. So just a little side note. We try and we know our profession's full of acronyms and jargon. So do you ever have any questions, please don't hesitate to ask if somebody's used an acronym or something. We're happy to try and remember what they stand for. So, okay, moving on. We may have talked about this a little bit, the timing for PROWAG compliance, especially as it relates to projects currently well advanced in the final design, bidding, and construction phase. So yes, I think even if it's not adopted and official and enforceable yet, I think there is an interest in getting some of these designs implemented sooner than later. So if you have, a project underway, do you have any advice on what to do about like what's in PROWAG versus what you might be, where you might be in the design and construction phase?
Yeah, I mean, that's another one where I will expect the DOT or DOJ to provide official guidance once they adopt PROWAG, that they will probably provide some guidance that, yeah, if your project's at 95%, that unless you can easily make the changes, then you may not be required to. But again, I would have to rely on whatever guidance they provide. Personally, I would recommend if projects are in design and we can reasonably make changes to bring it in full compliance, that's probably the right thing to do, especially since once it is adopted, the next time you come through with a project, then you're going to be ripping out what you just installed and making edits. And, you know, while I focused on the things that were notable changes between the draft and the approved version, there's still a lot of content that remained the same from the previous draft. So it's really just a few small elements that would need to be updated to be in full compliance.
Great, thank you. And Andy, if you have further follow-up, Andy Kaplan, I know, does a lot on this topic as well, and is quite involved with a lot of the engineering organizations in New Jersey. So raise your hand to unmute if you would like to be unmuted to follow up. In the meantime, we got another question. What would be the purpose of APS push buttons for a pre-timed signal operation? It can still have audible features without a push button as the signal phase is on recall. Or can it, I guess, have audible features if it's on recall?
So you're still required to provide the APS push button, even if you have pre-timed signals, and that's to communicate not just the audible information, but also to provide that vibrotactile information. So for those of you not familiar with it, next time you're at a push button that is compliant, press it and keep your hand on it, and you'll notice when the walk sign comes on, the button will vibrate. So people that rely on that vibro tactile information wouldn't be provided that if you omitted the push buttons. And I'll note that the city of New York just lost a lawsuit on this very issue, that they don't have push buttons, and their argument was, well, we have pre-timed signals, we don't need push buttons. And the courts ruled, though, you absolutely do need the push button. So again, the legal precedent sometimes sets some of these requirements for us.
Interesting. Okay, that's good to know. I do sort of remember something about that New York City lawsuit, but I hadn't quite put it all together with PROWAG. That's good, but thank you for that. Peter.
And I did find that that site in in Hawaii, and you could see, you know, there's a natural pedestrian desire line coming down from this large hotel. And so they've set the stop bar all the way back here. And so you have this big wide crosswalk on one side that tapers down to a normal crosswalk width on the other side. So just reinforcing that there are times where having different widths can be appropriate. And then the key is just making sure that if you do have those conditions, that you're thinking about the longest crossing distance, so that at a signalized intersection, you're providing the appropriate amount of time to cross the intersection.
I think we can all agree that all of us need to take a field trip to this location sometime in the near future. I would love to go take a look.
Yeah, I mean, if you've got to go to Honolulu to do a field visit.
You know, we might have to. It's a little far from New Jersey, but you know, we can dream. Okay, Peter Bilton, you had a question. Go ahead and unmute.
Yeah, thanks, Leanne and Jeremy. So, and this one's easier to explain than type. Way back in the beginning, when you were talking about alteration projects and how they should be addressed, PROWAG should be addressed to the maximum extent feasible. I was thinking, and how exceptions are documented, I was thinking that there are probably lessons learned for New Jersey's complete streets policies, because even though the complete streets is, you know, it's wide open in terms of the type of accommodations and design that are used, the model policy and the policies that are at the municipal, county, and even state level, they provide for exceptions and documentation of exceptions, but the guidance is not standardized in terms of how to document the exceptions. So right now, it's pretty much just like, you know, the engineer designing the project has to write something down somewhere that says, we didn't do X, Y, Z because, you know, there's insufficient need, or the slope didn't work, or something like that. So, but that's not standardized. And I was thinking there might be are there lessons learned? Are there places that states that do a really good job of documenting their PROWAG exceptions, their ADA exceptions, or forms, templates, places that do it well and document it well that we could learn from to improve how we document our complete streets exceptions?
No, that I know of. I mean, many states have a curb ramp inspection form to document technical and feasibility for that. But I haven't seen agencies that have a good process for documenting non-compliance with other elements like sidewalk slopes or number of accessible parking spaces or the pedestrian detour accessibility issues. So I think it's important if we're doing a project, like personally, we're documenting it in our project files, why we arrived at a certain decision in case that's ever called into question. But for example, we're working with Wisconsin DOT right now to update their multimodal design guidance. And as part of that, we've been discussing including some of these additional checklists and documentation so that if there are other elements that aren't compliant, that there's a official way of documenting it, not just putting it in the project file.
In New Jersey's Complete and Green Streets model policy, there are checklists that can be adopted. And in those checklists, there's a maintenance section that would be like, are you providing ADA accessible detours during construction? But there's not like a follow-up to that to make sure it actually was ADA accessible. It's just, it's a checklist that to help people remember that that's a part of when you're doing maintenance. And that's only if, like I say, on a municipal level, they've adopted this checklist as part of their policy. So there's bits of that in New Jersey, but like, I think, Peter, you make a good point that we don't do a good job documenting when
setting the expectations for, like, if you're looking at the checking the box sidewalk and saying, no, we did not provide, then it's just an open text box saying, give us the reason why, as opposed to providing fixed criteria for the project engineers to respond to. So, but thanks, it's a helpful conversation.
Thanks, Peter. Okay, we have another question. When designing a shared use path that will be parallel to a road where the slope is greater than 5%, would PROWAG have specific techniques to make the shared use path accessible?
So if it's a shared use path that's paralleling a roadway, then it simply needs to match the slope of the adjacent road.
Okay. Although you could go beyond that, right? That's the minimum. But if you needed to do some sort of excavation or make the slope a little less in some sort of engineering way, there's ways to do that.
Sure. And I guess I've seen that done where there's a roadway underpass. So a road and a sidewalk go underneath of, say, a highway. The road itself where the vehicles are needs a certain amount of vertical clearance. And so that will be at one slope. But I've seen locations that have the sidewalk at a more gradual slope and less vertical clearance. So that would be an instance where you could provide a sidewalk environment or a shared use path that actually has a shallower slope than the adjacent roadway. I could also imagine it at like approaching a vertical curve. You might be able to do additional excavation for the sidewalk. All that said, PROWAG does not require you to do that. It would be something that you're doing above and beyond to address accessibility.
Okay. And earlier, so Elise, I don't know if you want to jump in. I also have a question that I've personally got pressing, but Elise, I think you can unmute yourself since you're a host. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you. Let me lower my hand. I was really interested in your slide, Jeremy, about the bus stops and your comments about making sure the bus pads are connected to the local sidewalk network. I'm sure that's not unique to New Jersey, where we have a lot of bus stops that are just located along the side of the road with no sidewalk and no bus pad and things like that. But the ones that do have bus pads, I'm very curious to start working on these issues as to connecting them to a local sidewalk network. But that raises another question for me is we're now reviewing projects of developers along our state highways that were requiring them to install sidewalk along their frontage, but then it ends at their property line. And is there recommendations as to should we be transitioning those sidewalks to the shoulder? And if so, how?
Well, it's not something PROWAG addresses. I know PennDOT has language in their design guidance that talks about even for a developer-led project, if it's a large enough development, they'll require you to extend your sidewalk to a logical terminus. So that's one where, you know, as part of the review process, we should be thinking, is there a logical place within a reasonable distance that would require a developer to install something in front of another property, but would help to connect and complete the sidewalk environment. Beyond that, though, yeah, PROAG doesn't address transitions to a shoulder. And again, we would only want to be doing that if there was actually an accessible shoulder that they could use.
Right. Thank you.
All right, and Arlea, I'm going to jump one question because it's a little bit related to, I think, what Elise was saying. And we were just talking about like push buttons and accessibility. I didn't see anything about like countdown signals. Is that anything that's is that part of you're going to have to, the requirement when it's adopted will require the push buttons. Presumably there's some sort of pedestrian signal head. Is there a promotion or a requirement for the countdown signals as part of that, or is that optional?
I should really know the answer to that.
Sorry.
I don't.
Oh, I did
no.
I stumped Jeremy.
I don't think that that's covered in PROAG, but it is covered in the MUTCD, and I might be misspeaking there, but that's my recollection.
Okay. I believe at least on the state level, when there's a push button, there are countdown signals, you know, as of, I can't remember, that was an internal decision some years ago. So that, you know, that's not necessarily, you're going to see it everywhere, but it's moving forward. So I just wondered if that was covered, because I know when we've talked with folks with disabilities, they really do rely on that countdown signal often if they are sighted, you know, people that if they don't have sight impairments, that's one of the things that they tell us that is a really important part of being able to cross the street. So the other question, I may have missed it. You talked about the decorative surface materials like bricks and stuff and sidewalks. Is there anything that covers that in crosswalks too? We see sort of like sometimes that fake brick or actual real brick in crosswalks. Is there any requirement for a smooth surface, even if you have like brick decorative on the sides, but as long as there's a smooth center in a crosswalk?
It simply requires that the accessible route be firm, stable, and slip resistant and meet all of the, you know, grade change requirements. So I believe that's still technically compliant, but I try to discourage against that when a client is recommending it, from that perspective of people who use wheelchairs, who might have spinal injuries or brittle bones. Any sort of rough surfaces can be jarring. So I would reserve those sorts of treatments for the edges of the crosswalk, sort of defining the edge with a rougher material while keeping the central portion smooth. And that's consistent with the design of sidewalks as well, that you generally want the accessible route to be that smooth material. And if you're going to do decorative materials, that would be reserved for the edges, which is not part of the accessible route. It's part of the circulation path.
Oh, okay. And so that would be a 4-foot minimum or 5-foot, 6-foot preferred, right?
Yep.
Okay. One other question I have for you, because this came up for us. So parking protected bicycle lanes. There's been some lawsuits in the media about making sure that when you're doing some sort of parking protected bike lane, that you have to address the accessibility for somebody from the parking space to the sidewalk. Is there anything, did PROWAG cover any of that in this edition, or is in anything in the new MUTCD that you've seen on that?
No, and that's what I was saying, that the PROAG didn't envision separated bike lanes when it was crafted, and so it doesn't address that. The AASHTO bike guide will have guidance on that, and I'll try and get back to that slide just to ensure everybody understood this one. So like I said, this is what I had shown in the previous drafts of AASHTO, but that ultimately that will need to be revised to something like this so that we have the full marked space, and then you need a curb ramp to those accessible spaces. So the need for the curb ramp is a requirement of accessible parking spaces, but you only need to have the minimum number of accessible parking spaces per the block perimeter. Then I don't think I touched on it, although it is on this slide actually, that there are exceptions to that as well. So that if you're not altering the sidewalk as part of your project, there's no requirement in a standard accessible parking space. There's no requirement to move that curb line and provide the full 13-foot width. So it does allow you, if you're not touching the sidewalk as part of your project, to locate an accessible parking space at the end of your block or nearest to an existing mid-block crossing, so that somebody who does get out the driver's side of their vehicle has access to that nearest existing curb ramp at the street corner.
Okay. I know there's a lot of examples in New Jersey where somebody has requested an ADA accessible parking spot in front of their apartment building.
Mm-hmm.
So this is still that kind of, you would need a ramp, because I don't think all of those have ramps.
I think that,
is that a stumping one too? Like,
well, no, and I think it's a bit of a gray area as well, that when somebody requests an accessible parking space in front of their house, then the scope of work is to install a sign. It's not to reconstruct the sidewalk to facilitate that. So I don't think there's anything that prohibits you from installing an accessible sign, and that is delineating that space for that user. In general, we'd want to locate that though closest to the intersection or closest to a mid-block crossing, so that if they are using a wheeled mobility device, that they have access to that ramp.
got it. Okay, that's good to know. All right, and then our last question, so while you have your slides up, is specific about trapezoidal delineators. So there's a question of like, can you explain what those are a little bit more? And like, it seems like there's several different types of examples of that.
Yeah, so I was showing those here on the last slide that I covered, and essentially that they would be installed guiding you out to the detectable warnings. While we were talking, I pulled up just a website that has what that looks like. It's essentially a plastic curb. So it has it is not intended to be traversed by a person with a disability. It sort of would define the edge of an accessible route. They are traversable, just not accessible to traverse. And by that, I mean that the slopes and heights of them don't meet the requirements of PROAG as an accessible route, but most people using a wheelchair would be able to get over them if they absolutely had to. So these are recommended along those edges so that a pedestrian can be guided out to the edge of your crossing and not inadvertently veer in your painted curb extension, find their way through your flex posts, and end up out in the street without being aware of it. So that's based on some research that's being done right now, or is wrapping up right now, from Federal Highway. I can put the the information on that project in the chat. It's not a project we're involved with, but it's being led by a company called Accessible Design for the Blind. But I believe they're completed with the research and are just finalizing the recommendations now. So I'll put that in the chat. It's project 2149.
As we have a lot of municipalities and counties that have gotten some of the SS4A funding and will be looking at doing demonstration projects. So I think we're going to need to do a little bit of our own research and homework to help them identify how to better make them accessible when they do quick builds and demonstration projects. Do you know of any other further guidance that's coming out that we should be looking towards for that? I know my understanding is FHWA is working on accessibility and quick builds or demonstration projects. I saw something at TRB this year in January. So, and they had said something about having some sort of guidance in the during the winter of 2024. And since we just hit spring yesterday, I still haven't seen it, but maybe it's out there. But yeah, I mean, I think this is going to be a continual part of the discussion as we do these demonstration and quick builds, which are really can be important to us figuring out next steps with infrastructure. How we make sure that they're accessible to all is a big part of the discussion.
Yeah, the one that I put in the chat is the one that I'm familiar with that addresses accessibility in those quick builds. They may have other ongoing studies that I'm not aware of, but that one definitely addresses the quick build curb extensions.
Great. We're through our questions. I don't know if anybody else, I don't think there's any more hands raised.
I had a quick question, if you don't mind.
Go ahead, James.
Jeremy, so you mentioned that there's no guidance on sort of directional delineators to sort of guide people along a sidewalk. I'm assuming you participate in committees and stuff. Do you know why they didn't do that? Is that something they plan on doing in the future, or just sort of they don't see it at all as a need?
I think that it just wasn't included because it hadn't been in previous drafts. And so the fact that you can't just incorporate something that the public hasn't had an opportunity to comment on. It's one of the challenges of the federal approval process that you can't just slip something in at the end of the process without getting feedback. So yeah, it wasn't something that was in the previous drafts. In terms of when it might be included in something else, I have no idea. I mean, it's taken them 20 years to get this version released, and introducing something new like that does require additional research. And that said, Federal Highway does provide guidance on them in the Accessible Shared Streets Guide. Will similarly provide some guidance in the AASHTO bike guide for these instances where we have pedestrian facilities that are flush with bicycle facilities. And then some other guides, like I know the most current NCHRP guide for roundabout design talks about the use of directional indicators at the tops of bike ramps, but doesn't provide like specific design details to address that. I also have other clients that are just getting out ahead of it. So for example, the city of Austin is updating their standard design details to clearly spell out how directional indicators should be used if you're using them as part of your project. So yeah, I think that's one where the local agencies will get out ahead of federal guidance to try and address issues of consistency.
Thank you.
Thank you.
For answering that question, for answering everybody's questions, for your presentation. I mean, round of applause. I'm sure it's a little quiet in the Zoom world, but fantastic presentation. I really appreciate you joining us today, Jeremy, and sharing your knowledge of PROWAG. Really, really appreciate you coming and joining our meeting today.
Yeah, happy to do it. Thanks for having me. And again, if people have questions, feel free to reach out. Happy to help.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful.